The UN has slashed its official figures of women and children killed in Gaza. Data analyst Mark Zlochin explains how the fake figures have been revised. I'm Jonathan Sacerdoti. Mark Zlochin, thanks for joining me again. We spoke a few weeks ago about these fake figures released by Hamas on casualties in Gaza. And can we now start by looking at this news that the UN has effectively halved the number of women and children it says have been killed in Gaza, and then also look at the wider implications of this change? And also, let's look at how they announced this massive U-turn.
I think the how is the most amazing part, because they really kind of hushed the whole thing. I mean, they have almost a daily report about the situation in Gaza that includes a host of information, including the casualties. And I wasn't the first person to notice it, but there are several other people who are monitoring those reports, and they noticed that from one report to another, without saying a thing, they virtually cut in half the number of children and women they claim that have been killed during this Gaza war. And after a couple of days, when people started asking questions, there was a press conference with the spokesman of the UN, and he kind of, it was really, the explanation was almost as amazing as the way they did. He kind of tried to explain it with the fog of war. That was the expression that he used. And the impression he tried to create was that they're monitoring the numbers, they're checking the numbers. Because of the fog of war, it's very difficult to do. But finally, allegedly, they managed to get the more reliable numbers.
And just to be clear, that clip's gone around the world a bit. It was the journalist Mike Wagenheim, my colleague at i24 News. And to be clear what the change in the figures are, they went down from 14,000 plus children to 7,800. And that meant that women and children are no longer the 75% of all casualties that many media outlets around the world had reported, but more like 50%. Is that right?
Yeah, somewhere in the 50% range. So there are many reasons why this change by itself is dramatic. For example, one of the reasons why it's critical is, for example, that in the ICJ case, that South Africa filed against Israel, in the submission, one of the evidences that they claim to the alleged genocide was the percentage of women and children killed, and the numbers of women and children killed, and it's also it's bordering on criminal as far as I am concerned, because in the application, what they claimed was that the number of named, identified women and children is the percentage is about 70%. Okay, so then we're not referring to the general numbers. They specifically claimed that the number they present in the application is the number of named, identified women and children. And now it turns out that the real numbers are about half of what they were claiming. So, in other words, they were misleading the court when they submitted this application.
So to be clear, that's the International Court of Justice in The Hague. Yeah. South Africa, of course, brought that case against Israel. Both Israel and South Africa are signatories to the Genocide Convention, and South Africa effectively, for anyone watching who isn't familiar, is effectively acting on behalf of the Palestinians, or less charitably, Hamas. And what you're saying is that in their application that they submitted back in December, 29th of December, they made claims based on those original bogus figures, right? Something like 21,110 named Palestinians.
Maybe we need to backtrack a little bit and explain the nature of the change, because the change that they made, they still claim that the total numbers are the same total numbers they claimed previously, but they introduced a new information. Okay, in addition to the total number, which is around 34,000 at the moment, they claim that over 10,000 of those numbers are unidentified. Okay, so we'll come back in a second to the nature of those 10,000 people. But the new information is they say there are 34,000 overall, 24 have been identified, and the new numbers of women and children are from those 24,000 people who were identified. And if we go back to what I said about the ICG claim, South Africa explicitly claimed that the numbers they present to the court are numbers of identified casualties, identified women, identified children. And now we know for sure, and UN admits it, that this information is incorrect. Even this claim that UN is adopting now is itself problematic, and I'll explain why. The way they frame those numbers, they say, okay, there are 34,000 overall, there are 24 identified. The thing is that this framing is really new one. It was only adopted by the ministry, the Gazan Ministry of Health, about a couple of weeks ago. Before that, they referred to the same numbers as records with full information, okay? And before that, they used yet another terminology. They were referring to those numbers as hospital records. Okay, maybe I'll start from the beginning. From the beginning of the war till the end of March, they were talking about three groups, three sources of information. One is obvious, the most obvious one, the hospital records, the information from the morgues. Another source of information that was introduced in about November was what they called reliable media sources. And many journalists approached the Ministry of Health, tried to find out what those sources are. And somehow Ministry of Health never managed to explain the nature of those sources. And about January, they introduced a third source of information, the self-reports from the family members. Okay, for people who were killed or were missing, allegedly under the rubble. They just could fill in a Google form without presenting any evidence, without presenting any proof of death. Yes.
And were those the same? Were the reliable media sources and the self-reporting the same thing? Was one a rebranding of the other?
Eventually, what it turns out that the self-reports and the media sources initially were grouped together. About a month and a half ago, they started to report them separately, but they changed the names. I mean, they started to talk explicitly about the self-reports. And all the rest, what they used to call reliable media sources, they started referring it as records with incomplete information. Mm-hmm. Okay, so they don't say anything about the source of those reports, and they just say it's incomplete information. They don't give any details about what kind of information is missing. Obviously, one of the critical parts of information is where this information came from.
And effectively,
this is the part that is really missing.
All of this, which you're repeating now, is what we talked about some weeks back, and what was highlighted by anyone who cared to do the actual hard work of looking through the data as soon as it was originally produced. And that excludes most of the world media.
And I think this is one of the most outrageous parts of this whole story, that UN never bothered to do what I and several other researchers and journalists did. Just
so
look
actually,
at
they
just parroted the information that the Gazan authorities,
Hamas,
Hamas, you put out. And there are actually two sources of information there. We talked about the last time we had this conversation. Yeah. There is the Gazan Ministry of Health, and there is this so-called government media office, which is basically a propaganda office.
So to be clear, this is then what has caused the UN to change their reporting, was that it became impossible to stand by their just complete compliance with Hamas organization figures, especially after some journalists, some analysts had reported on it. And effectively what we're saying is, this is quite hard to believe, the UN is even worse in its acceptance of Hamas propaganda than the international mainstream world media, which has been pretty bad as well on that record.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it became untenable to keep reporting those numbers because they were obviously fake. There are absolutely, absolutely ridiculous inconsistencies there. After the change they made back in April, when they started reframed the whole thing, rebranded the whole thing as complete information versus incomplete information. If you cross-check the numbers reported by Ministry of Health and the Media Office, it turned out that supposedly there were more men with incomplete information, more women and children with incomplete information than the total of people with incomplete information.
And the point there is that even if, some people say, who cares if the percentages of women and children are slightly off, it's a difficult situation. Yeah. Obviously, that's quite a problematic position to hold. But actually, at least the numbers need to add up to 100%. So if you have figures
if you go over 100%, obviously it's a fake. I mean, and at that point, I think UN realized that they cannot repeat those numbers, and they dropped them. But before they dropped them, there was another change in terminology that Ministry of Health made, because after they made the first change, many people, me including, look at the numbers and say, okay, it still doesn't add up. Okay, there is something wrong. And even the records they claimed has complete information, and complete information means ID numbers, date of birth, age, etc., etc. By their own criteria, many of the data they published didn't have the complete information. So even the change of terminology, that didn't make sense. So they made another change. And now they started talking about identified versus identified versus unidentified.
And let me ask you again about this issue you mentioned briefly about the ICJ, the International Court of Justice. So you said that obviously there are implications for the UN revising these figures. And that's one that I noticed you mentioned in a post on X, which is, you said, I'll just read it out. It says that that South Africa's ICJ application against Israel, submitted on December the 29th, claimed the following: Israel has now killed in excess of 21,110 named Palestinians, including over 7,729 children. And then you say that the 21,100 figure appears in both the Ministry of Health and Government Media Office updates, both of those obviously Hamas organizations, from December the 27th. So that's where South Africa got those, submitted them to the ICJ, and you say that neither of them claimed that all those 21,110 alleged fatalities had been named. So they've added this named, effectively. South Africa
they claimed something that even Hamas didn't claim.
Right. So South Africa has gone beyond Hamas's figure and submitted it to the court, which then didn't so far call that out. And then you went on to say that the 7,729 figure comes from a GMO update published on December the 7th. That's the Government Media Office. Yeah. Again, without any claim that those children have been named. So on January the 7th, 1 week after South Africa's submission, the Gazan Ministry of Health published a detailed casualties name list, and that list contained 14,121 names, with 4,839 of them being children. So you draw attention to that, compare that to South Africa's claim that Israel has now killed in excess of 21,110 named Palestinians, including over 7,729 children. And you say that, in other words, South Africa intentionally misled the court, presenting made-up numbers based on reliable media sources, as if those numbers were verified numbers referring to identified fatalities. So the implications of this are actually enormous, because the International Court in South Africa's case is being used effectively to slur Israel before there's even a proper consideration of the case itself. Yeah. And the figures that South Africa has been putting to the court have to be, I mean, there's no explanation for this other than deliberate malice on South Africa's part.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And what are the other implications then? Because obviously, if they've changed the percentage or number of women and children named, but not the overall number of fatalities in their count, what does that say, A, about the validity of that overall number, and B, about their methodology and those percentages?
First of all, I want to say a few things about the gap between the total and the so-called identified, because I've seen a lot of people claiming that in fact, it's about 10,000 people gap, to 10,000 fatalities gap. Many try to frame it as if there were actual bodies lying somewhere that haven't been identified yet. Okay, and the reason people claim it, and some of them claim it not out of malice but out of ignorance, because of the terminology that was used by UN following the Ministry of Health. And I think that was exactly the intention of this new terminology, because when they were talking about reliable media sources, people were asking what are those sources, and they didn't have a good answer. Then they started talking about incomplete information, and people were pointing to the fact that even the names they did list have incomplete information, so it didn't make sense. So they kind of tried to hide it even more, but now using this new terminology of unidentified. But in fact, those are the same numbers. It's not like there are 10,000 bodies lying somewhere that need to be identified. Those numbers apparently are completely made up, because Ministry of Health never managed to explain where they came from. They just changed the name. Okay, so UN kind of went halfway. They realized that they cannot defend the numbers of women and children because the consistency is just too outrageous. So they stopped using the numbers that government media office supplied. Okay, and they switched to the numbers that Ministry of Health supplied, that are based on relatively more reliable sources like hospital records and self-reports. The thing is that this 10,000 bodies gap also coming from the same source, from the government media office. Okay, so its reliability is exactly the same as the reliability of the numbers of women and children. And if UN realize that the numbers of women and children are not defensible, it's really not clear how they can still quote the totals that are based exactly on the same source without any backing, without any evidence to back it up.
And can I just say here as well that you've also mentioned that in those figures, they're counting 18-year-olds as children, 440
Yeah, this
of them.
is something I realized just recently, because in the end of April, they published another list. And I just try to see how the numbers match up to the reports that UN provided, and turned out, and I think it's a recent development. I don't think they did it in the beginning of the war, but in the last, judging from the last list of the names, they started counting the 18 years old, which are not children by any criteria, as children in the total reports.
Especially as we know that, in fact, Hamas are guilty of the crime of using child militants. So that's people under 18. But if they're then going to count, the UN are going to count 18-year-old males as children and therefore not combatants, or combatants for Americans out there who've been commenting in the comments, then that's another problem with the data. And furthermore, last time we discussed the issue of identified casualties, identified deaths. So often the way they're identified is with the name and an ID number, but there are duplicate IDs. And so we know even now with these revised UN figures that there are still duplicates in there. Some of those people I've seen were actually listed as dying in 2014, right?
Yeah, in the last list they released, they removed most of the duplicates, but there are still about 1 in 6 entries missing some critical information. Either they miss the ID, or ID numbers are just invalid, and there is a way to validate the numbers. So sometimes it's just the number of digits is less than it's supposed to be. Sometimes the format is wrong.
So they've removed some duplicates, but they've left in erroneous ID numbers that are fake ID numbers. And then I've seen, as I said, some of those ID numbers have been listed in lists of deaths in 2014. And on top of that, despite removing duplicates, the total has stayed the same or higher. Is that right?
Yeah, this is something that I kind of monitored through subsequent reports that they were publishing. And it turns out even when they removed the duplicates, somehow the totals remained the same, or grew slowly.
So I suppose the implication there, the only possible non-nefarious explanation could be that Israel is matching any numbers they take off by killing exactly the same number in military action to make up for those removed duplicates.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, this is one possible explanation. Totally, if we look at the latest list published from out of those 24,000 people allegedly killed, over 4,000 really have some invalid or missing information. And another problem is that those self-reports that I mentioned earlier, which account for almost 4,000 people by now, I need to remind you and the viewers that no proof of death is required for this report to be included in the total count. People just fill in some Google form, no photographs, nothing to prove. So those people can be just people who are missing. Those people may be people who no longer in Gaza, who just went to Egypt. Those people could be just completely made up. Okay, there is no way to verify this.
And so, two more things before we wrap up. One is also that I've seen a calculation. I don't know how valid it is. That 1 in 6 of every identified claimed fatality has turned out to be erroneous. So, if 1 in 6 is erroneous, that really does cast doubt on the validity of any of these figures. But the other thing I want to just ask here is, because we're talking about the 4,000 there, that you're also saying you can discount the number of duplicate IDs. This doesn't touch on all the things we discussed last time, and it's not worth repeating them. People can go back and watch the last video if they want. But just to recap the headlines of that, none of these figures are counted natural deaths. Over a 7-month period, there would have been a certain number of those. Doesn't count any deaths that Hamas may have caused, or other groups like Islamic Jihad from misfired rockets, of which there have been thousands, presumably. It doesn't count any of those things. So again, what I want to ask here is, skeptics of the analysis you're doing and others will say, well, you can't just slash these figures apart so much so that it ends up showing that Israel's actually conducting some sort of surgical military operation with historically unprecedented, world-leading accuracy of killing combatants more than civilians, better than any other army in any comparable situation. But in fact, that is exactly what you and other experts are saying, correct?
This sounds like what the numbers are implying. I mean, if you cut through the noise, and sort out all the entries with missing information, and all the things that you said, like natural deaths, people killed from misfired rockets, etc. We get somewhat, maybe even under 1-to-1 combatants to civilians ratio, which is unprecedented. And before we wrap up, there is another thing I want to mention, that all this analysis was based on detailed reports that the Ministry of Health was publishing, and it really allowed to catch inconsistencies both within the information itself and when compared to the Gazan media office, government media office. So after the last change, when this change of UN reporting blew up, and the whole subject started to get more and more attention, they found a brilliant solution to this problem. They just stopped publishing those detailed reports. The last report was published in the beginning of May. We are 20th of May as of now, and there was no single detailed report since. So just stop providing this detailed information that allowed to catch them lying.
And so now what is the nature of the reporting?
They just report the totals without any details about the hospitals, about the self-reports. You cannot slice it. You don't know the detailed demographics. Don't know the information about the specific sources. You just put out the total numbers, and that's it. So it's more difficult to catch them lying. With when the information is much more restricted than it was in the past.
So it's worth saying, just as we close then, that obviously you are trying to look at this from a data analysis perspective, where you look at the data that we do have, the sources of that data, and then cross-referencing all the different lists. As you said, they're making that a bit harder for you now. Effectively, it is very difficult to come up with definitive numbers, not to want to sound like the UN spokesman, but there is the fog of war. There are the problems of inability to report independently on this, not least because Israel doesn't allow journalists and others into Gaza at the moment. All of these caveats aside, we can only work on the data we're given. Israel finally came out in an interview with the Prime Minister, I think with Dr. Phil, strangely enough, saying that it had rough figures for how many civilians and militants it believed it had killed. And so we're basically working with all of these relatively inaccurate sets of data and basically trying to cross-reference them. And also bear in mind, I think, not for data analysts, but for us journalists, we then have to use our judgment and the audience has to use its judgment on the sources of that data. So once it's been analyzed, we then have to say, well, Israel might emphasize this, the Palestinians under Hamas might emphasize that, the UN might emphasize something in between, though I think the belief that the UN is a fair and independent arbiter is also somewhat eroded even among those who held that position. But I thank you very much for running us through these latest developments. I think it's extremely important that we continue to shed light on this stuff, and you're doing a brilliant job, so please keep up doing that. And anyone who wants to follow Mark on X can do so at Mark Zlochin. That's MarkZlochin. He posts there frequently as he's working this stuff out, and it's extremely enlightening. So, Mark, thanks again for shedding light on this very important aspect of what's going on in Gaza.
Okay, thank you, Jonathan, for the opportunity to talk about it.